Tonight we begin with a development that U.S. intelligence officials had feared, that NATO commanders had warned about, and that the White House had been preparing for behind closed doors. A threat that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington. Hours that forced emergency consultations between the Pentagon and Downing Street. Hours that reminded the world that Vladimir Putin's nuclear rhetoric is not just bluster. It is a calculated weapon of psychological warfare. What Putin did today crossed a line that Western leaders had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with speed, and with a level of tactical sophistication that sent a message not just to Moscow, but to the entire world. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic communiques, just signals, that Putin was preparing something unprecedented in his approach to Western powers. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and London this week was that the predictability went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Kremlin activity know the indicators. The sudden repositioning of strategic assets, the unusual patterns in military communications, the changes in state media messaging, the sudden silence from usually vocal propagandists. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For months, we've watched Putin dance along the edge of what Western officials call responsible nuclear signaling, the kind of rhetoric designed to intimidate without triggering actual escalation. But this week, something changed. The rhetoric shifted from general warnings to specific targets, from vague implications to named nations, from hypothetical scenarios to what sounded disturbingly like operational planning. Intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic noticed the shift immediately, and they began preparing for what they feared might come next. Early this morning, U.S. intelligence agencies detected what they described as an unprecedented shift in Russian strategic messaging, including direct references to American and British territories that had not been made in this manner since the height of the Cold War. These are the kinds of statements that Putin only makes when he is signaling something very specific. Preparation for escalation, a test of Western resolve, or a desperate attempt to change the narrative of a war he is struggling to win. Analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency in the Western world pays attention. Putin's statements, broadcast on Russian state television and repeated across Kremlin-controlled media platforms, were unmistakable in their intent. He spoke directly about the United States. He spoke directly about the United Kingdom. He referenced their support for Ukraine not as a diplomatic disagreement, but as an act of aggression that would be met with consequences. Those who provide the weapons, Putin said, should not believe they are beyond reach. That sentence alone triggered emergency protocols in at least 4 NATO countries. The response issued by U.S. and British officials tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials after emergency meetings described Putin's move as dangerous, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of internal desperation. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most precise and strategically significant we've seen in the entire course of this conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of Putin's threatening statements, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated precision strike operation deep inside Russian-controlled territory. These weren't the standard drone operations we've seen throughout the war. These were advanced, long-range precision strikes, systems and tactics that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to send an unmistakable message. The timing was not coincidental. The targets were not random. This was Ukraine's answer to Putin's threat, delivered not in words, but in action. Ukrainian officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that the strikes were designed to demonstrate capability, to show both Moscow and the West that Ukraine remains a formidable force, regardless of what rhetoric emerges from the Kremlin. "We do not respond to threats with fear," one official said. "We respond with action." Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukraine launched precision strikes on Russian military infrastructure, including a command center in occupied territory that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned offensive operation. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute. They hit logistics hubs. They hit communication nodes. They hit ammunition depots that were likely preparing to support the next phase of Russian operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's military planning in the region. The infrastructure that would have made the next Russian offensive operational. This is what made Western officials' warnings so urgent. Putin's threats weren't just symbolic, they were actionable. They represented the kind of escalation that could spiral beyond anyone's control if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike population centers. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit military command facilities. They hit weapons storage sites. They hit the exact targets that would degrade Russia's ability to follow through on Putin's aggressive posturing. The precision of these strikes tells us something important about Ukraine's current capabilities. These were not the improvised operations of the war's early days. These were sophisticated, intelligence-driven strikes that required real-time coordination, advanced targeting systems, and the kind of operational security that only comes with extensive training and support. Western military analysts watching tonight described the operation as textbook precision warfare. One former NATO commander said, "This is exactly what you want to see from an ally under pressure: calm, calculated, and devastating." And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest threats were designed to test the cohesion of Western support for Ukraine after months of political uncertainty in Washington and Europe. Putin wanted to see whether the West would fracture, whether the United States would hesitate, whether Britain would back down. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for Western permission. They launched a response that was so swift, so precise, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Putin's rhetorical shift as coercive escalation, a way to change the narrative and create fear without actually changing military reality on the ground. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and resolute. Their strikes were not only militarily significant, they were calibrated so precisely that they avoided the kinds of civilian casualties that Russia routinely causes. That distinction matters because it shows the fundamental difference between how these two sides are fighting this war. It shows that Ukraine is not simply defending territory. They are demonstrating to the world what responsible military power looks like. They are showing that precision and restraint are not weaknesses, they are strategic advantages. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out strikes on at least 4 separate Russian military positions, forcing the evacuation of command personnel from forward operating bases. Ukrainian missile, forces targeted radar installations that had been upgraded in the last several weeks. Special operations, units operating behind enemy lines, reportedly disrupted communication networks used by Russian forces to coordinate artillery strikes. This wasn't just retaliation. This wasn't just symbolic resistance. This was operational dominance. This was battlefield initiative. And battlefield initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early months of this invasion. For every advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their supply lines, disrupts their command structure, or degrades their combat effectiveness. Tonight's strikes were no exception. They were designed to hurt. And by all accounts, they did. Russian military bloggers, usually a reliable indicator of actual battlefield conditions, went unusually quiet in the hours following the strikes. That silence speaks volumes. Remember, Putin thought this war would be over in 3 days. He thought Kyiv would fall before the world could respond. He thought NATO would fracture under the pressure of energy prices and refugee flows. He thought Ukraine would negotiate from weakness. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking with precision that Russia cannot match. The West is united in ways that Putin never anticipated. And the Kremlin is issuing threats that reveal desperation, not strength. Every time Putin has escalated his rhetoric, Ukraine has answered not with fear, but with action. Every time Russia has threatened consequences, the consequences have fallen on Russian forces. This pattern is not lost on military historians. This is what happens when an invader underestimates both the will and the capability of the people they are trying to conquer. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Putin's latest threats happened at a time when he is under enormous internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want more aggressive action. Russian oligarchs want an end to the sanctions that are destroying their wealth. Russian mothers want their sons to come home. Russian propagandists want victories to broadcast. Putin is balancing these competing demands while fighting a war that has gone catastrophically wrong. And when leaders in that position make sudden, aggressive moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's threats against the United States and United Kingdom should be understood in that context. This is not a leader with endless options. This is a leader running out of good ones. And that makes him both more dangerous and more predictable. Dangerous because cornered leaders take risks. Predictable because those risks tend to follow patterns that intelligence services can track. The White House's statement, now circulating across diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to be intimidated by nuclear threats. Officials said plainly that Putin's rhetoric was inconsistent with responsible international conduct. That is diplomatic language for, we know what you're doing and it won't work. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. British officials were equally direct. The Foreign Office released a statement condemning Putin's reckless and dangerous language, while reaffirming Britain's unwavering support for Ukraine. Behind the scenes, we're told that emergency consultations are ongoing between Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin. The goal is clear: present a unified front that leaves no doubt about Western resolve. Putin has spent years trying to divide the West. Tonight, his threats appear to have done the opposite. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed his nation in a calm, defiant speech tonight. He said, "We do not respond to threats with surrender, we respond with strength." He said, "Every missile that Russia fires at our people will be answered. Every threat will be met with resolve." And he said, "Ukraine stands not because we are unafraid, but because we understand what happens to nations that show fear to tyrants." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelenskyy's message was clear. Ukraine will not be cowed by Putin's nuclear saber-rattling. And judging by tonight's precision strikes, those words are backed by action. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest threats weren't isolated. Along with his direct statements targeting the US and UK, Russian strategic bomber activity increased along NATO's northern borders. Russian naval vessels repositioned in ways that suggest preparation for extended operations. Russian cyber units increased probing attacks targeting Western infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Intelligence officials are now working to determine whether these moves are coordinated preparations or simply coincidental timing. But in the world of strategic intelligence, there are no coincidences. Everything Putin does is calculated. Every move serves a purpose. And right now, the purpose appears to be maximizing pressure on the West while testing the limits of what they will tolerate. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a major winter offensive and using threats to deter Western interference. Another is that Putin is attempting to fracture Western unity by forcing leaders to publicly debate their risk tolerance. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for a negotiated settlement that leaves Russia in control of occupied Ukrainian territory. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for diplomatic negotiations. They didn't defer to Western caution. They didn't give Putin time to exploit uncertainty. They struck. And in doing so, they sent a message that any negotiation will happen on Ukraine's terms, not Russia's. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether threats can accomplish what his military has failed to achieve. Ukraine wants to show that military capability matters more than rhetoric. The United States wants to prevent escalation while maintaining support for its ally. And Europe wants to prevent a wider war while standing firm against aggression. These objectives are not always compatible. But tonight, they appear to be aligned in ways that Putin did not expect. The test is ongoing. The results are not yet clear. But the early indicators suggest that Putin's gamble may have backfired. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian command channels for signs of how Moscow will respond. They say there is confusion in Russian military leadership about how to interpret Ukraine's strikes. They say Putin's inner circle is divided about next steps. And they say the decision to directly threaten the United States and United Kingdom is likely part of a broader strategy intended to regain initiative that Russia has been losing for months. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is pressing their advantage. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that threats will be answered with action. And it sent a message to the West that their support is not being wasted on a country that cannot defend itself. Ukraine is proving, night after night, strike after strike, that they are a capable and determined military force. And that capability is Putin's worst nightmare. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with today's threats. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It demonstrated capability that Russia cannot ignore. It reinforced Western confidence in Ukraine's military effectiveness. And it showed Putin that escalation works both ways. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the coming days. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a dangerous new phase. If they recalibrate, Ukraine and the West have already shown they are prepared for whatever comes. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Putin appears to be uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet, And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he should have learned long ago. Threats only work if your opponent is afraid. Ukraine is not afraid. And the West is standing with them. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Putin's threats did not divide the alliance. Ukraine's response demonstrated strength, not weakness. And the world is watching a nation refuse to be intimidated. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.